Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to a new episode of Music Evolves here. I am your host, Sean Martin, where I get to talk about a passion of mine, music, and another passion of mine, technology, and the combination of the two, and how those two to come together with creativity to help music evolve and touch us all in ways that maybe we expect, maybe ways we don't expect. And that's the beauty of it. Music can come in many forms, one of which is through medium LP, long play records. We're going to talk about vinyl, kind of the history of vinyl and the future of vinyl as well. And I have a very good friend on with me, Larry Jaffee. Good to see you, Larry.
Nice seeing you, Sean.
It's been a while. For those who saw the post, we've known each other for quite a bit. Met in person for the first time just the other day. It was really good to have that moment with you.
Yeah, same here. It's nice to have you on this coast too.
I know the East Coast, the right coast, as some might say. I love it here. I didn't wear my Yankees hat, but I am in New York, and I love the city and the energy and all the options for music. Literally, in the last 3 nights, I've been to 3 different shows, all about music.
Oh, well,
Yeah, and I might go again tonight. The Philharmonic is playing, so lots of opportunity to experience and explore different genres of music and meet different people and feel different things every day. Um, so Larry, you and I met. I don't know how many years. We won't date ourselves. How many years ago we met, but we crossed paths in the cybersecurity world. You're a journalist. I'm a journalist. We talked about threats and risk to business and it's an exciting space, but not like music. And like like me, I believe you have a passion for music, and you have an even deeper passion for vinyl and making vinyl and listening to vinyl. You even brought a portable record player the other day when we met and spun a few records, which was it was pretty cool. That was a moment in itself. So maybe for folks who don't know you yet, maybe a little background on who Larry is and what you've been up to. Describe your love of music and your why you have an interest in vinyl, and then we'll get into why vinyl.
okay. Well, first of all, I love that the podcast is called Music Evolves because you couldn't have a better name to describe what happened with the vinyl comeback. And unlike cybersecurity, the music industry often goes through cycles, but they're very slow catching up, as an industry. I mean, some things happen, but I'll give you an example. CDs launched in 1983, but it wasn't towards the end of the decade where it really connected with a consumer audience. And the industry sort of made it happen. But to your question, who am I? So I guess it was my love of music began as a child when my grandmother gave me a transistor radio for my 5th birthday, and the Beatlemania was happening. And my father, actually, I remember us watching the Ed Sullivan show, and my father said, "The Beatles are a communist plot." And I really didn't know what a Beatle was, and I don't know. I didn't know what a communist was, but whatever it was, I wanted to know more because it gave him that reaction, Um, and I also, one of my earliest childhood memories actually is taking a bath, probably in 1964 too, when the song "Downtown" was on, and I was singing along again. I didn't know what downtown was, but it's just I like this Petula Clark, the English singer, actually. So I guess my mother had the radio on, and my mother was a big music fan. Bobby Soxer with Frank Sinatra and all that stuff. So fast forward to the time I was about 11, and I started a new school, and this kid had a tape recorder, a reel to reel, but a small reel to reel. and he played it for me, and I was just amazed that you could record your voices, and I was like, I was putting two and two together. How can I do this with music? Now I wasn't a musician myself at that age. I wouldn't call myself a musician now either, but but I've attempted a couple times. But um, it what I remember I had birthday money about 2 years later, and I was like, "Where can I get that reel-to-reel tape recorder?" And the department store didn't have that, but they did have a cassette recorder. So it was like my first, and it was like one of those FBI rectangular ones. And I remember buying my first pre-recorded cassette was Chuck Berry's London Sessions, which had the, My Dingaling song on it, which I just thought was
Ah, yes.
wrong. Even at that age, I was able to pick up on the double entendres. But like the next year, 1972, I was already realizing I need to graduate to a record player of some sort. And I I bought a on one turntable. It wasn't like a real stereo component, and I guess it came with speakers, come to think of it. And I was able to attach like a cassette deck to it. So I put together almost a stereo system. It must have had a preamp built into it or something like that. So at that point, I remember my first record was introducing the Beatles. Um, for like 99 cents, it was a cutout or something. I never figured out if it was a counterfeit or not, because that's like, for that record in particular, there are plenty. I still have it, by the way. Uh,
Oh,
that particular, exact copy of it. But like within the next week, the Rolling Stones Hot Rocks Greatest Hits double album came out. So I bought that. And then like a week, I don't know, maybe next month, I caught the Bob Dylan bug, and um, I got Highway 61 revisited, and then by like for the next 4 months, I think all I ever listened to was Bob Dylan. Because I got the greatest hits, I got Blonde and Blonde. Any money that I made, on I think by this point, I don't think I was working in a supermarket yet. My allowance money or whatever, my birthday money I would save up, um, would go into records. Um, I do remember I was working at a supermarket, wishing I tried to get a job at a record store. I mean, I asked around, but no one had that. I
how
mean, like
how
the place where I bought actually the second Rolling Stones Hot Rocks album. I remember asking that guy in Smithtown, Long Island. Yeah, it wasn't the first time I bought records at his store either, for a job, and he didn't have one for me. I was very disappointed.
imagine working at Tower Records or
Yeah,
Amoeba Records,
right,
early days. Would have been
right.
so much fun.
So, I mean, I had amassed, I realized I wanted to be a writer, and I remember I reviewed the Rod Stewart concert for my high school newspaper. It was one of the last Rod Stewart and the Faces concerts, actually, the Faces as a group. I tried to talk my way in with like a phony press invitation or something like that. Didn't work. So, but I
Typical.
realized I wanted in the music business, but I didn't know what area yet, you know. But what happened was, while I was still in high school, um, I volunteered to interview bands, to be at the high school dance, perform at the high school dance. And it was great. I wasn't a very social kid either at this point. I never like joined clubs or anything like at that point. But when I saw there was an opportunity to get into the music business through the school, I sort of grabbed it. And then
Mm.
I auditioned, I think, 3 different bands, and the one I thought was the best was the one that got the gig, and I became their manager. And we were all underage, 16 or 17, and I was able to get them jobs at bars, with liquor licenses.
Nice.
Yeah, and getting back to it, I mean, I had my own band at that point that
Right?
I was the lead singer, and I remember playing it for the guitar player of the other band, and that I was managing, and he was impressed. Like, he thought I did like a passable, vocal, akin to Mick Jagger, and he went. The weird thing was, I went to a different high school as those guys, but the guitar player in my band went to their high school. So we were like sort of like the baby band. Well, they never asked us to open up for them though, which is probably just as well. We never made it out
Uh,
of the living room. We weren't a garage band because we used to rehearse in my friend's living room, the bass player's living room, I think it was. So,
so I want to get to the vinyl, because I remember having a boom box carrying on my shoulder, and I didn't have a lot of money growing up, so most of my money went to blank cassettes, and I would record stuff off the radio and listen back to it. Um, then eventually I got into cassettes, and I have a ton of CDs, and I have some collector albums, LPs. Um, Not, I know they're a huge collection. I believe you have a decent collection of records as well. But I guess for me, that I was there in a time where you could create your own and record your own music on a cassette, right? And kind of capture your own moment. It's hard to do that on an LP. So LPs are pretty much they're more about being produced and pressed and released, and somebody can take the music. So how did because you talked a little bit about the cassettes there, and obviously
yeah,
you could
actually,
create CDs for yourself too with music, but talk to me about the LP and then the desire to get involved with that.
yeah. So, well, just on the cassette, it's uncanny that you bring this up because 2 hours ago I was giving a lecture about mixtapes, and a
Oh
friend of
yeah.
mine is the founder of something called the Mixtape Museum, and she and I actually gave the history of the format and how it connected to DJs spinning vinyl, the evolution of it, so from what's really interesting is in the 40s especially, you could go into like a retail establishment and record a record. And in fact, at Third Man Records in Nashville, they have one of these old booths where Neil Young himself actually recorded an album about 10 years ago. And anyone could use this booth. And I didn't do it myself, actually, but I've been to the store several times. And, sometimes people come in with guitars and they play their song, and this like, there. So it was like a lost art. And I'm not really sure why it disappeared, but
Hmm.
it was possible. On the other hand, especially in the 40s and 50s, there were plenty of places to get recorded. And actually, at Sun Studios in Memphis, Elvis Presley made his first record for his mom, and Jack White actually ended up buying that record, I think, for, I don't know, $750,000 or something like that. I should know the
Wow.
exact amount. Right. So,
I'm sure he knows the exact.
right. Right. So, um, so
It's
I
interesting. I'm gonna have to ask my dad, because I know I have a 45. My dad played on a 45. It's a single, obviously, and I can't imagine there are many of them. It's a rock band. He played horns on it, funny enough, and I don't think they went to a big formal production company. So they must have used something like that in LA, perhaps. I don't know. I'll have to ask him. It's interesting.
yeah, actually, like I said, there were plenty of recording studios, but the interesting thing about Elvis Presley in particular, my grandfather on my mother's side was a gadget. He was a mailman. He was a letter carrier, but he had these interesting hobbies like photography, and he was like the first on his block to have a color television, and one he also loved Elvis Presley, and I understood that he had a record collection although I only met him a couple of times actually because my grandmother and my grandfather were divorced by that point in the 60s. So I had been to his house maybe twice in my entire lifetime, and then he died in 1969. So, but I remember once I was a teenager collecting records by that point, and I asked my mother what happened to the Elvis records, and she said she didn't know. But I do remember when he died, like it was like relatives were like vultures, like taking
Oh yeah,
his
I
stuff.
bet. Yeah.
And not if anybody in the family was the rightful owner to that that collection would have been me. But um, but I mean, through college, once I graduated college, I was always writing about music. For example, I remember one of my first professional assignments was um, covering a Jerry Garcia concert, and I hated it. I mean, at that point,
Hated the gig or hated the concert or
I hated the
all of
concert.
it?
I just thought it was very monotonous that almost every single song sounded alike. I did like the Grateful Dead American Beauty album, so it wasn't like me, but the Deadheads hated my review and they let the magazine know. But that didn't deter me at all. And also around the same time, I had published an article in a fanzine about Sid Vicious's murder trial, which I actually covered. It was a pre-trial hearing at the court. It was my first glimpse of what a media circus can turn into. And I was in the elevator alone with Sid Vicious and his lawyer. And one of the things that I asked him, I knew I couldn't ask him about the case. Did you do it? But I did ask him, did you hear the new Clash album? Give Him Enough Rope just came out like the week before or something. And his lawyer said to him, don't answer that. And I was like, why? And then the door opened, and that was
Ah,
my. But it was the only three of us who was in the elevator, and Sid was going through withdrawal symptoms. I mean, it looked horrible. Um, so, um, on the technology side, I mean, I remember, especially, when I was managing the band and stuff like that, I would talk to the sound engineer and things like that. But I mean, at one point, I wondered, should I go to school for that type of knowledge, or do I want to do it? And I decided I was just going to stick with like managing and writing about it, like from that perspective, not so much be a participant in the making of music or anything like that.
right.
I sort of
So
regret it because I think I could be a very good producer.
I can imagine you could be. I can imagine you could be. Um, One of the things I wanted to cover, I mean, I have, it's kind of like the inception of the record. We Most people probably picture a disc, right, with a hole in the middle, but some of the other options early on were cylinder shape.
Yeah, actually,
And
that was the first format war. Edison had the cylinder, and Emil Berliner, a German expat, moved to the United States in 1888. Actually, patented the first circular record. But this is interesting. In my archives, I found this magazine from 1931 called The Gramophone. Um, and at this time, the records were made out of shellac. Um, Robert Crumb, the cartoonist, is a 78 collector. And I did a couple of interviews with him over the years. And I remember telling him that he was in a book about vinyl collectors. And the first thing Crumb said to me was, I'm not a vinyl collector. Yeah, I collect 78s, not the same thing.
well, describe the difference for us.
Okay, so
So what
78,
is shellac? What is and vinyl? And then we can talk. Obviously,
yeah,
at
I
some
mean,
point,
the
we'll talk
the
about what comes
initial
from.
78s were just one-sided, and they were made out of shellac. They were very heavy. They were very breakable. And I've actually bought, look at record fairs of the last 20 years. A couple times I bought um, records that I thought were protected, and then when I got them home, They're broken. It's happened like at least twice.
Gotcha.
So they only were able to hold like 3 minutes on a side, you know. Um, so
Now,
I
why
mean,
is that? The format of of the the information pressed into the tracks or the players, or what was the limitation there?
um, yeah, it was in terms of the technology, it evolved and they figured out a way to capture the sound waves on a different type of material and actually extend it to 15 or 20 minutes per side, and you get both sides. They figured out a manufacturing process that could not only do it but also automate it. Um, and it would have happened sooner, but the two things that happened were the depression. So this magazine is 1931, and there are ads for like records, and as you could see, there's a graphic thing with these are definitely circular records.
Right?
Um, here's an ad. The cover broke off, but here's an ad for Columbia Records. Um, and this is a pretty healthy magazine. I mean, print magazines don't have as many pages as this. I mean, this is like at least 52 pages or so, this issue. Um, so the format war, by the way, with the cylinders with Edison, that sort of ended by the 20s. I mean, Edison finally realized, you know, he kept the cylinders going for a while, but it was a losing proposition. And one of the things he did was vertically integrate like into hardware, like which was a smart thing. And the labels actually did that too, as well as there was a tie-in to broadcasting radio, so RCA was in it, but they also had a label, so what the other major thing politically happened was World War II. And the LP would have been introduced a lot sooner. And RCA was actually developing their own version of it, but Columbia beat them to the market. But so in 1948, the first LP was introduced. And, a few years ago at my conference Making Vinyl, it was the 75th anniversary of the LP. And we had a presentation about that, the history of, how it all came about. And the other thing that was happening in the 50s was that RCA, although they lost the LP battle, they beat Columbia in terms of or it was more of a concept, the single, 7-inch single. Now, getting back to the shellac 78s, they were a different size. They were like, 10 inches. And often what they would do is combine a bunch of songs together and they would put them in what they called an album. And I was friends actually with the man who was credited as the father of modern album packaging, Alex Steinweiss. And I convinced him to speak at our conference. And I actually named the packaging awards after him. And this happened in probably about 19. Oh, I'm trying to think the dates actually. No, maybe it was about a year later, 2000, 2001, when we did our first packaging awards.
When you talk packaging, you're talking about the sleeve
What?
and the
Yeah,
line,
well,
the
it was
notes, and all
interesting
that
at
kind of
that
stuff.
point. Come to think, I haven't really thought about this. So no, it was actually 2003, and I was working in LA. I would go to LA at least twice a year for a conference that we ran, and it was a DVD production primarily. You know what? At that point, DVD was all the rage. Um, and then in 2000, we started that conference in 1998 when I first joined the magazine as editor, and um, we partnered with a trade association to do it, and by the next year, I ended up getting the responsibility for the entire conference. And I thought, I'm in Hollywood. I want to expand this. And I invited Peter Bogdanovich, in fact, to be a keynote. And managed to get like almost $20,000 for his speaking fee and his first class travel. But by 2003, we expanded into also having a separate packaging conference and packaging awards. And that's when I was able to get Alex Steinweiss to meet. Actually, the Grammy winner for the previous 3 years was a guy named Kevin Regan, also from LA, who was Madonna's packaging director, art director. So Kevin, it was really interesting to watch Kevin and Alex compare notes about, how their assistants would steal their tools and their ideas and like all this stuff, and they missed a couple of generations, and in between, actually, the MC of our packaging awards is a friend of mine named Craig Braun, who was responsible for example, the Velvet Underground and Nico package with the peelable banana in early 1967, and then the Rolling Stones Sticky Fingers and Alice Cooper's Schools Out. These are all famous because they really broke, not rules, but they set the bar in terms of ingenuity, in terms of packaging for a record. He also did Cheech and Chong's with the rolling papers. That was his. He came up with a marketing campaign to have a big joint on the side of one of the LA buses. So anyway, I mean, that was probably the most fun job I ever had, because I got to meet really creative people in the music business, and also I was able to invite for example, in that magazine, I interviewed Lou Reed, who's always been one of my heroes, and put him on the cover of the magazine. And he talked, for a half hour just about his gripes with the business,
When did the picture disc come around?
That's a really good question. I don't know the exact date, but there were examples of it before the comeback. I mean, that's not like a brand new thing. I mean, for example, in the 70s and 80s, there were picture discs. I have some of them in my collection.
I think I have a Quiet Riot doing a Duran Duran, and they seem to be very popular in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about the comeback is they've gotten more creative with formulations that, in fact, I recently saw a podcast that talked about how the way the record spins, it's almost like it's a visual video. I mean, it's not, like they've gotten very creative, and that's not to say. I remember in the early 70s, one of my favorite artists was a British musician named Dave Mason. He had an album called Alone Together, and it was like a big thing that he had like a marble-looking record, but it's far more creative in terms of, in fact, at my conference making vinyl, we brought back the packaging awards. So when we did the Alex Awards originally from the early, I guess 2003 was the first one that we did. We had a vinyl category, which at that point the comeback was sort of in its infancy. I mean, there was still some pressing plants. For example, Erica Records is in Southern California. I remember them participating.
Talk to me about the kind of the slowdown, and you've mentioned the comeback a couple times.
Yeah. So
what's the driver behind that? I mean, nostalgia is something that I continue to see and experience and feel in the music world, but is it driven by other factors too?
So in the late 70s, home entertainment changed. The video games first came on the market, and then also there was a VHS Betamax war, um, that you could tape television, you know, and there was all kinds of litigation going on. The MPAA, said it was theft and intellectual property theft and things like that. But they ended up winning by 5-4. I mean, it was very slim. Okay, I mean, everything could have really changed much differently. So young people were not really buying records as much, especially by 1981, November 1981, MTV came, and cable TV was still in its sort of infancy at that stage, but the people who had it, to have like a 24/7 music video channel was amazing. And people, instead of like, you know, listening via the stereos and buying records or tapes, cassettes. I mean, and let's not forget 8 tracks were really popular in the 70s. Um, so the labels realized they had to reinvent themselves, and what they did was they created the CD, which was another format war between Sony and Philips. They made peace, and what is great about this CD is it got people used to rebuying their collections on a completely different format. Oh, the music was the same, but they rebought it, but at twice the price, which is it's like history repeating itself as far as the vinyl comeback. But the way that the industry managed to make that transition, like as you say, evolves, was that they told the retailers they won't accept returns anymore on LPs. So often the labels would manufacture more than they really needed. The industry was really corrupt at the time. They would keep 2 sets of books. And there was a adage that records were shipped platinum. No, I'm sorry, shipped gold but returned platinum. Gold is 500,000 copies. 1 million. And the reason they did that was because, and this could be even a band like the Who, right? That the cutouts, they didn't have to pay the artists as much money. So it corrupt. I mean, it was really not a very nice time in the industry. And
Right.
I mean, not that. I mean, there was also counterfeiting. There was bootlegging.
Mhm.
And I actually interviewed one of the people who ended up, ratting out the mob connected gangsters who were in on this. I took the FBI people. I mean, I did some investigative reporting. Billboard actually published one of my articles about that stuff. So I think the industry rode the CD cash cow too far by keeping prices way high. Because, in fact, my first article was about CD prices. This was in 1998, early 1998. What really happens with that 1798, list price, when I learned that at the most it cost like $1.50 to manufacture the CD. Where was the money going? And much like today's streaming world, with most of Spotify and all the other streaming services accounting for most of what appears to be the music valuations, it's like smoke and mirrors, really, because that does
Mhm.
not really trickle down to the music creators and the artists. It's the deals that they make with the major labels, and then depending what kind of contracts they have with their artists, do they get paid that,
Does that change any with LPs? Because I know a lot of artists have made an effort to release records. not just
Yeah,
streaming
I
stuff.
mean, I mean, the artists have more power than they usually. A lot of artists, and I know this from the managing side, a lot of them don't want to deal with the business stuff at all. But the more savvy ones realize that they don't have to say yes to everything during the negotiation period. And what they can do is when they go on the road, say, well, we want to put our own records. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had interviewed not interviewed, but I met him at a gig. Mark Lanigan, who passed away a few years ago, great independent artist, was in a band, what are they called? Screaming Trees out of Seattle. They were part of the grunge scene that came out of it. They were assigned to, I think, Sony at that point, the Screaming Trees. But Mark Lanigan, once he left that band, he did almost everything independently. I mean, very rarely would he have put out anything on a major label. And I think there was a reason for that, because he wanted the freedom to do what he wanted. And the independent labels, who were really behind the vinyl comeback in a much bigger way than the majors, with the exception of Warner, which was never sort of gave up on vinyl like they would do. Like they would put out like a Neil Young greatest hits, which they didn't really release on CD. They thought it might be a special thing for vinyl collectors. The other thing about the vinyl comeback is that it never really went away, because there were audiophile labels like Classic Records in Southern California, for example, that were putting out really great packages and great sounding LPs. There's a company in Southern California called RTI pressing plant that did really fantastic work. They're still in business. There was another one called Rainbow Records, which was the oldest for a long time. And unfortunately, they decided not to continue just as the pandemic hit, but also the cost of doing business in California just became too much. And in fact, the movie Straight Outta Compton used Rainbow Records office. And you can see the plant actually in the film. And the owner, Steve Sheldon's a friend of mine, and he told me how they came in and used his facility for some scenes and things like that. So getting back to why the comeback happened, it was around the same time that Tower Records went initially chapter 11 and chapter 7. So in 2007, there were two or three factions of independent stores that talked to each other a lot. And they realized that anytime when somebody would bring in a collection of used records that they wanted to get rid of because they were buying CDs, those records would be bought almost immediately. And it happened on a repeated basis. At the same time, some of them also had they also sold comic books. And the comic book publishers had something called Free Comic Book Day. So two different retailers, one in Atlanta and one in Maine, basically went to one of the heads of the this consortium of retailers and said, maybe we should do like a holiday for, what we sell, and out of that idea, they met in Baltimore in the fall of 2007. And the funny thing is they left this topic for the very last thing, and people were leaving the convention and like the conference, and there were only like a dozen people left. And it was sort of like Woodstock. People claimed they were there, but you wonder if they were just
Actually, at that
I'll
moment,
give you an example. Newberry Comics is one of this like small chains that they do a really good job in curating what records they put. They also license their own records, and they do special colors and editions and things like that. So anyway, everyone thought this one guy was the representative, and so he reached him on the phone and he said, It wasn't me. It was my colleague, and so I interviewed the two of them together actually for the book. The interesting, you mentioned me writing about cybersecurity. So, um, in the fall, it was September 30th. I learned that SC Magazine was being sold and they didn't need my services anymore, and I was writing pretty regularly, for them at the time, and it paid really well, by the way, compared to any other journalism. So, um, and like the next week, I get a call from the co-founder of Record Store Day, and
Which is the holiday, right? Record Store Day.
yeah, he says that, our 15th anniversary is coming up. How would you like to write our book? So I said to him, Michael, I was born to write that book. Now here's the reality. I mean, my magazine that I mentioned, it was called Media Line, was killed in 2006, but I left the company about 4 months earlier because they couldn't afford me anymore. And they realized the person under me made half the amount of money, but then they were also selling the company, and the title did not survive actually. So, I was sort of grew disenchanted with physical media totally, and I was in a relationship with a woman who, was very into feng shui and, minimal stuff. And, so I remember trying to digitize all my CDs and things like that. And I was at one of these physical media conferences that I helped put together. And I'm telling a friend of mine, one of the other speakers, that I just sold my 4,000 LPs. And he was like, "You did what?" This was like in 2010. And within 2 years, I realized what a colossal mistake I made. And I would say in the last 14 years, I've recreated that that collection. It's about 4,000 LPs, and there's no more space for anything else in my apartment.
So they make up your table. That's your pillow.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I think there's there's certainly, I mentioned nostalgia. I think there's certainly a desire to have LPs, and I know kind of the packaging and the marketing. There's a lot that kind of goes along with a record as well. That I know some of the artists put together that kind of extend the value beyond just the record too. So I think there's a lot around that. But maybe I know we're getting here on time, but I want to talk quickly about the kind of the quality and what you hear when you play
Well,
a record versus a CD versus streaming. And there are people who may not know the difference or tell the difference, and then there are certainly people, audiophiles, who can say, "No, I need an LP on a tube based stereo system." Right? I have a buddy who has a tube stereo system. It's pretty cool.
I never considered myself an audiophile, mainly because I never wanted to spend that kind of money on hardware. Um, it just seemed like a very intense hobby to have, constantly upgrade. And whereas I was fine. In fact, I was writing for High Fidelity. I did some reviews for them. If they knew what kind of like lousy CD player I was using, Symphonic, which at the time I paid $300 for. But it was, and the speakers were nothing special. Um, I so you could argue forever whether which format is better, but it really depends on what exactly you're listening to, because the vinyl production process can go wrong in so many different places. But the same thing, a CD has to be properly mastered as well. The same thing is true with an MP3 track, which doesn't really come close to the quality of a well done CD, actually, in terms of the amount of information that, is presented. To your point, though, not everybody's ears really listen that carefully. But there were bad sounding CDs in the beginning too, because they didn't master it properly, and they just used the vinyl masters. And Apple actually, that was like the stopgap. And just going back to tapes for just a brief moment. From 1985 until about 1992, the cassette was like the leading pre-recorded format, because people eventually gravitated towards the CD, because that was all that the retail stores were selling by that point, because they weren't accepting the returns, but they would take the returns back on the CD actually. So, and that's how they made sure that the format stuck. But getting back to record store day, so in 2008, Michael Kurtz, one of the co-founders of this, the coined it record store day, spoke to a lot of labels, and initially there was only about a dozen special releases. That was the only time you would get this limited edition thing. But what they did was they got Metallica to do an in-store appearance on that first record store day, and there were over 500 people there. Rasputin was the name of the store, and it was a success. And then, I mean, even Saturday Night Live, Seth Meyers, was doing Weekend Update and sort of made fun of this thing called Record Store Day. That was like the next year, actually. But the founders of Record Store Day realized that once a national television program is making fun of you, this thing is for real. And every year it exponentially would grow, in terms of the number of people finding out about the number of people. And also by the next year, 100 releases. Labels were like, wow, there's something here. So they all wanted to be part of it, but it still took a while for the major labels to jump on the bandwagon.
So I don't know if they're called plants, but are the pressing plants expanding as well? And I know, maybe give us a peek into the future. Vinyl is questionable in terms of a sustainable component, right? So maybe give us a view into what's coming up.
So, when I came up with the idea to do a vinyl manufacturing only B2B conference, and actually I pitched it to a friend of mine who I had done conferences with in 2013, and he thought it was too much too soon. But then a few years later, he called me. He goes, "Remember that idea about the vinyl conference? We're going to do it." I was like, "When?" He goes, "This fall." Now, at that point, Jack White had just opened up Third Man Pressing in Detroit. And the planets just lined up. Jack agreed to do our conference. But the time that we were doing this first event, we knew that there were 35 pressing plants on both sides of the Atlantic. A few of those were sizable operations, like United Record Pressing in Nashville, and Rainbow Records was a decent size at that point. And there were some major ones in Europe as well, in Germany, France, Britain. So what we didn't know when we had this first event, we had 17 of those companies that we knew of, the 35 that we knew of, speak at the event. What we didn't realize was there were 20 people in the audience who were planning on opening their own factories, imminently. And the same thing happened the second year we went back to Detroit in 2018. And it was like exponentially in terms of the number of people jumping on this bandwagon and realizing that vinyl's comeback was real. It wasn't a fad. And it got more and more press. I did want to get back to the technological improvement So some of the tools have improved, that they're able to catch defects sooner and things like that. They do quality control is very important. But still, I mean, it's an involved process that hasn't really changed all that much since Berliner in 1888. So, and the other thing is, I mean, it defies all logic, and that's why the the subtitle to my Record Store Day book is called "The Most Improbable Comeback of the 21st Century." A friend of mine said to me, he thought the title was, kind of funny, since like we're only like a quarter century into the century. I said, yeah, but what's next? Like rotary phones? I mean,
They're coming back. No.
and then the valuation of records, and this might not trickle down to the artists unless you're an A-list in terms of getting vinyl money. But, a $30 retail record, and the band actually manufactures their own and takes it on the road, they're making a pretty handsome profit off of that. A record that costs like $10, that cost them about $10. So, but if they had to wait for the labels to, pay them, that would take quite a while. And the other interesting thing about the future longevity potential is young people are now interested in it. So, for example, the best-selling LPs last year, 9 out of 10 were millennial and Gen Z favorites. And true, Taylor Swift was counted for 5 of the 10. The only one that was not was Fleetwood Mac Rumors, which has always been on the list. And usually you would have like a Beatles Abbey Road or a Purple Rain or Michael Jackson Thriller. Those are the 4 that usually, or Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Those are the ones that always show up. But kids, and I know this because I'm teaching a class now writing about music. Last semester, I had 17 students. Only 2 of them were into vinyl. This semester, I have 6 who are collecting vinyl, 6 who are collecting CDs, mainly because they can't afford the vinyl. They want to. And I have 20 in that class. So, and it seems like I asked, well, why'd you get into this? And they said, well, my dad, loved it, and I got his records. So
in the last moment, talk to me about the makeup of the material and the things you're working on.
yeah, so I mean, so it's poly vinyl chloride, which is a plastic that Greenpeace says is the most harmful to the environment. And part of the problem is not so much of the PVC itself, because it is true that is recyclable as a plastic. But on the other hand, it's the stabilizers like lead and cadmium that, make sure that the records don't warp very easily and scratch and things like that. That is the toxic problem with it, especially. So sustainability is like a major part that the major labels have formed. The 3, Universal, Sony, and Warner, have formed something, the Climate Collective, a music industry climate collective. And they're looking for solutions. And in fact, one of my things, in addition to still running the conference or making vinyl, is I'm not making vinyl. I decided through osmosis to jump into this. And I found out about a plant-based material called that was developed by an English company called Evolution Music. And we made our first record actually last November, and we did it at the Iceland Airwaves. We distributed it at the Iceland Airwaves Music Festival. So the Iceland government has really, welcomed us, and we're planning on building a factory there. My co-founders and I.
Super cool. That you brought one of those records the other day, right?
Yeah, actually, I have one right here. Actually,
and of the 2 that you brought, it was not warped. Funny enough.
no, it wasn't.
So super cool. Well, Larry, you have stories galore, I'm sure, and I'm so glad we reconnected. And I love this chat. Making vinyl, that conference is coming up. We're gonna have another chat on that, and hopefully you'll bring some other folks from the conference to talk to us a little bit more about. You mentioned quality. That's a topic I'm interested in, kind of the process of how it's all created and pressed, and we didn't talk about needles and players or any of that kind of stuff that could be interesting. So we'll get into some of those things, and I know you're gonna talk to Marco, my co-founder, about Record Store Day and the book that you wrote for that. So another conversation coming up with you here on ITSP Magazine as well. But really good, my friend. Good to see you. Thanks for sharing your insights here, and hopefully everybody enjoyed this conversation. Larry, more coming. Everybody else, keep creating, keep listening, and let the music move you. This is Music Evolves with Sean Martin. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.